What's up, motivators? My name is Taren. It's no secret that over the last few years, everyone has caught on to the fact that strength training is not just an important part of endurance race success, it's a critical part of endurance race success. By not including strength training, you are almost guaranteeing that you're going to underperform what your very best possible race could be. The unfortunate thing is that people still don't understand how to incorporate strength training into endurance training properly. So we've created, and we are going to go through today, this complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes. So whether you are training for a triathlon, a marathon, any sort of running race, a cycling event, a duathlon, a swim run, a trail run, anything like that, we can help you with this today. We're going to go through what gains can you expect to see from including strength training in your endurance training, the science behind what you can expect to see from including strength training into your endurance training, the risks of doing so, the common errors that people end up experiencing that hold them back from having that excellent race and actually having a good experience including strength training into their endurance training plan. The exercises that people should and shouldn't really do for their endurance strength training. Specifically then, we're going to get into sets, reps, and weight that is going to be complementary to your endurance training. And then finally, how do you actually implement this into a training plan? Because it's not as simple as just taking traditional methods of strength training, lumping it onto all of your endurance training, and moving on. It's a little more complex, but through this podcast and YouTube video, we are going to go through everything here today.
My name is Taren Gazelle. In my late 20s, I was overweight, unfulfilled, and couldn't even run to the end of the block. Over the following 10 years, I lost 65 pounds racing triathlons, running races, cycling events, and world championships. But eventually, the suffer culture of endurance sports training caught up to me, causing health issues and injuries. Now, my company Motive and I are on a mission to help people live more fulfilling lives by reaching endurance sports goals using healthy methods. We can all kill it on race day without killing our bodies. Let's do it.
If you're watching this and want to consume this long form video in podcast form, go over to the Taren's Motive Method podcast, where you're not going to miss out on anything. We'll explain everything so you can listen along. If you're listening to this in podcast form and you want some of the visuals that we are sharing, go over to the Taren's Motive Method YouTube channel, where you can consume this in full video form. The first thing we're going to begin with this complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes is the gains that you can expect to achieve by including strength training into your endurance training plan. I'm gonna say this as a spoiler alert, hands down, one of the best things you can do for your overall health and for your endurance training performance is include strength training. The gains are numerous. We're going to get into what you can expect to achieve right now. The gains that you can expect to achieve, the tangible things that you can take away from including strength training into your endurance training plans are numerous, but I've summarized the 6 really big ones here. The first one being improved economy. What that means is not your GDP, it's not the inflation rate that we might be hearing about in the news these days. It is the energy that you are expelling in doing your endurance training plan. So the energy that you are using to swim, bike, run is actually going to be less at the same pace by including strength training. I believe the reason for this is because your body is able to function with more muscle groups and more muscle groups that are functioning really well. So by doing that, it's less of a load on your body because it doesn't have to work overtime, like fire at a higher rate with fewer muscle groups when it has more muscle groups to work really well with. You might actually think that it would actually be the opposite, that you get big and bulky and actually have to use more energy to propel yourself forward, but it's actually the opposite. You're going to use less energy than you would otherwise. The second thing, and I think that this is very important for all of us, is hormones. There was a time where I actually believed that people getting to the Ironman World Championship, they were better able to adapt to and handle the rigors of endurance sports training, and that their hormones therefore would be better. But even at the Ironman World Championship, where these people are, by definition, the people who are able to withstand the rigors of endurance training better than most of us, 60% of the athletes who were tested there actually had a suboptimal hormone profile. This is really, really important for all of us aging endurance athletes, because if we make our hormone profile worse by including endurance training, we're actually increasing the speed at which we age. We're increasing the likelihood that we're going to have sleep disturbances, which then makes our hormones worse. We're increasing the likelihood that we will maintain fat and not be able to hold a good body composition. We're increasing the likelihood that our muscles will deteriorate at a faster rate, increasing the likelihood that we will have a severe injury later that will completely sideline us and ruin our quality of life as we age. Having a good hormone profile is really, really critical. Third, related to that, is muscle sparing. As we age, we've heard the adage that every year past the age of 40 that we lose roughly 1 pound of muscle mass. This loss in muscle mass is largely what's contributed to the vast amount of injuries that happen in broken hips, broken bones, limbs, and things that sideline you when you're 50, 60, 70. Quite often, these major sidelines where you're bedridden for several weeks, if not months on end, are the leading cause of poor quality of life in the latter stages of your life. So we want to maintain that muscle as long as we possibly can. You might think, well, it's just part of aging. We've actually seen that in 70-plus-year-olds, they can maintain and even grow muscle mass by including strength training. But if you don't include that strength training, it just withers away. And if you're doing nothing but endurance training, it withers away even more, because your body goes, hey, all of this muscle is more mass that I have to push, and it's making things more difficult, so I'm just going to get rid of it. You don't want that to happen, because it's likely going to lead to poor quality of life later on. Fourth, again related to that, is body composition. We all want to look and feel good. We want to be able to take our shirts off and say, hey, that's a fit dude or dudette there. If you are gradually losing muscle mass over and over every single year, it's more likely that you are eventually going to look in that mirror and just look like an old person. The longer we can hold on to that muscle mass, the better our body fat composition is going to be, the better we are going to feel about ourselves, the better we're going to be as a healthy human. So this is very important to make sure that we maintain that muscle mass just from a body composition standpoint, because the body composition standpoint is a good proxy for being a healthier human overall. Fifth thing related to all of this, as I mentioned, it's injury avoidance. It has been proven that strength training is a very good way to combat the likelihood of sport-specific injuries occurring. In addition to that, as I mentioned, one of the biggest things that will decrease your quality of life significantly, and I can think back to my uncle who had a fall when he was around 60 or so that was so severe that it resulted in a stroke, and for the rest of his life he's been basically chair-ridden. This was somebody who was the life of the party, the center of attention. He organized all the family parties. But now, for the last several decades of his life, he really hasn't been able to live the life that he wanted to live, and this was all because of incurring one major injury. If we can avoid the likelihood of that happening as we age, the better our lives are going to be. And wrapping that all up, this is all kind of the same thing. It has aging benefits. By being more mobile, by being stronger, by being more agile, by being able to hit yourself on the edge of a coffee table and stop yourself from falling, by being able to go for a ride or a run and not be bent over and injured or feeling terrible the next day, the longer we're going to be able to enjoy our lives, the longer we're going to be able to live our lives. And that's all what we really want, right? Finisher medals are great, and the plaques on the wall for what we've accomplished in endurance sports are great. But if we can't look back on them fondly and actually experience those for decades and years to come, what are we doing this for? We don't want to sacrifice our health long term for some short-term goals. when really well-designed endurance training plan can supplement your endurance training goals and your long-term life goals. So let's marry those two by getting all of the gains that we possibly can and include strength training into our endurance training. Next, in our complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes, let's talk about the science. How do we know that what social media people and what podcasters and YouTubers are saying about including strength training for endurance athletes is actually the case? Again, spoiler alert here, there has been many studies testing it one way and another way with advanced athletes, with novice athletes, with adding a lot of strength training, with adding a little bit of strength training. The bottom line is that almost no matter what way the study is done, it is conclusive that strength training is a performance enhancer to endurance athletes. There's no way around it. So let's get into some of the studies and how significant the improvements are. Getting into the science of endurance training, it has become very apparent from dozens and dozens of studies that strength training is a major performance enhancer to endurance training, period. It isn't controversial, it isn't a maybe, it is. It is a performance enhancer almost no matter which way the study is designed. And I just want to share with you some of the studies here. If you're listening, the podcast show notes will have links to all of these studies. If you're watching, links will be in the description below. This first study here called Maximal Strength Training Improves Running Economy in Distance Runners. I'll give you the Coles notes of all of these studies. Basically what this was saying is that strength training that you wouldn't normally associate with being for runners, being training for a 1 rep max, like Olympic style lifting, lift as much as you possibly can for 1 single rep, improved running economy in distance runners. So complete opposite ends of the spectrum. We're talking long distance runners and using Olympic lifting, heavy lifts, improved economy. It reduced the amount of energy that people needed to actually do their running. This next study called Concurrent Endurance and Explosive Type Strength Training Improves Neuromuscular and Anaerobic Characteristics in Young Runners. It is a really bad title because the gist of this study was that, well, let's back it up a little bit. One of the reasons that most people don't do strength training with their endurance training plan is because they say that they're so busy with their endurance training that they don't have time to do it. This study actually found that the athletes who replaced 19% of their endurance training with strength training saw more benefits than the athletes who just lumped the strength training on top. My personal belief is that the reason for this is that when athletes lump strength training on top, it's just overload. It's too much too soon. And by actually replacing some of that, so you're not actually spending any more time exercising, you are going to reap more benefits than if you did more. More isn't always more. An appropriate amount is more, and quite often, when it comes to strength training, you should start by replacing some of your endurance training with that strength training. So don't think that I'm asking you to do more hours, I'm asking you to just lift more things. This next study is really important because one of the big criticisms of strength training studies, or really all fitness studies, is that they're typically done on small sample sizes with young people. The typical study is 8 to 16 people, and because young people at colleges are really easy to turn into test subjects, it tends to be males who are 18 to 24, and that's not representative of the entire population. So this study called Strength Training for Middle and Long Distance Performance, a meta-analysis, was really important to me because a meta-analysis, a review, is something that analyzes as many studies as they possibly can, takes out some of the errors and inconsistencies and things like that to pull out the global trends that apply to the most amount of people. And what was really interesting to this is they looked at what strength training did to swimmers, to cyclists, to runners, and to people who were advanced or total novice. And the takeaway was that no matter what the endurance sport, no matter the level, being advanced or a complete beginner, strength training improved the performance of those athletes. This is about as definitive as we can get. Finally, one of the other criticisms that strength training for endurance athletes gets is that, well, we don't know for sure that it reduces the likelihood of injury. Well, I've got a bit of a problem with the people who are saying that the studies are inconclusive. One reason for this is that strength training, as it relates to injury, is a very, very hard study to actually perform. A really, really well-designed, really conclusive study tends to be about 8 to 12 weeks with a very small sample size so that you can control all the variables. And as you start getting longer and longer periods of time, it becomes really hard to control the variables. One of the longest studies that I've seen with a really well-designed variable controlled scenario was only about 3 months. And in this case, that study that was just 3 months long was lauded at the time for being amazingly in-depth and long and really all-inclusive for a long period of time. That's just 3 months. So when we start looking at studies that only amount to 8, 6, 10 weeks and saying, well, because we didn't see anything in these 6 to 10 weeks, therefore, for the long term, we see that strength training doesn't improve the likelihood of reducing injury, I think that's really kind of cherry picking some data, especially when we see this meta-study called Strength Training as a Superior Dose-Dependent and Safe Prevention of Acute and Overuse Sports Injuries, a Systematic Review, Qualitative Analysis, and Meta-Analysis. It basically said that yes, when we look at all of the information that we can possibly consume and see what effect strength training has on endurance athletes and overall athletes' likelihood of injury, it reduces their likelihood of injury. I think that's about as good as you can get. If you take it one step further and say, all right, you know what, that's the science, and you can find one study that says one thing and then another study that says another thing. When I talk to physiotherapists, when I talk to running coaches, and running is a really big crackerjack box of injuries, so run coaches who are really incentivized to keep people healthy, and they say that the athletes who include strength training are less likely to experience injury, I don't know what more we can say. The studies show that it improves economy. The studies show that you can reduce your endurance training and improve your endurance training performance by replacing some of that endurance training with strength training. It lessens your likelihood of injury. You're going to go faster at the same effort level or use less energy at the same speed. By all accounts, every which way you slice it, I can go on with dozens and dozens of studies like this. By actively choosing to not include strength training, you are choosing to not perform as well in your endurance races and in life. I want to take a minute to thank our first sponsor, being UCAN. Now, UCAN is a better way to start your day. I've typically talked about it from a performance improvement benefit because UCAN is a carbohydrate that doesn't spike your blood glucose and then cause a crash later. But I actually use it, as you can tell, by there only being one bar in this box and an empty package of granola, that I like to use this as the way to start my day because it's not that terrible bowl of cereal that spikes your blood glucose, causing a crash later in the day. It's also not the bulletproof coffee that, yeah, it gives you some calories, but it really doesn't get you any energy to start your day or get to your workout. UCAN bars and granola are something that I have just about every single morning because it's an excellent way to get something in your stomach while keeping your blood sugar nice and stable. So maybe you've tried UCAN as a performance tool in the past, but UCAN as actual food to start your day with as a replacement for energy bars or oatmeal or cereal or granola, and having that nice stable blood glucose with a good amount of energy is an excellent way to do this. If you want to get a discount on UCAN, you can go to ucan.co/Taren, where we've got a guide for how I like to use UCAN in training. But if you buy anything at that website through ucan.co/Taren, you will get a discount applied at checkout. I dig this stuff. The next section in our complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes is the risks involved with including strength training into a training plan. What are the ways that people can go wrong and actually do themselves a disservice? What are the ways that people might have actually experienced that somewhat common thing in the past where people go, well, everyone's talking about strength training being a performance enhancer, but here I am not actually seeing that. Why would that be the case? Getting into the risks and drawbacks of strength training for endurance athletes, I couldn't not post this picture. If you're listening over podcast, just Google synthol fail. You'll go down a rabbit hole of what synthol is. That is really, really funny. People actually think that this synthol dosing looks good. It doesn't look good, but I couldn't not include that. Just getting though into the risks and drawbacks of including strength training, while I talked all about the science and how good it is for you, there are certainly some risks if things aren't designed well. There are 5 big risks that I see by including strength training and not doing it in such a way that you've thought through it or that it's even endurance sports specific. The first one being reduced energy. This is probably the most common one that endurance athletes experience. This is what happens when they take up strength training and then go, I'm just so beat up from my strength training that I don't feel like going out and doing all of my endurance training. Really, really common. This is one of the first things that people say when they think about, well, I should probably include some strength training because Taren's talking about all this studies and the science about how good it is and all those hashtag gains that I can get, but I just don't feel good. That feeling good is not inherent to the strength training itself. It's inherent to the way the strength training was designed. So don't think that strength training as a whole is just going to lead you to having reduced injury. What we're going to talk about in the next sections and the other videos, if you're watching this video as a clip video, is we're going to talk about how you actually design strength training within your endurance training plan so that it complements and doesn't compete with it. Related to that is the second risk or drawback from including strength training. This one is actually, I would think, very, very legitimate. This is training tired. I've heard a lot about this movement towards being a hybrid athlete where you go and you do a pile of weight training to get really muscular, and then you also go and do a pile of running to be able to do running races. The nature of that muscular strength training is that it's going to break down your body. It's going to create small little muscle tears, little bits of muscle damage so that your body can then, once you consume protein, build itself back up, and it's going to build itself up bigger, better, and stronger. That nature of strength training, of breaking yourself down and then going and running after, is really looking at 2 different things. Breaking yourself down is going to require time where you rest and you recover and you get anabolic. Your body becomes in the building mode. But then going and running is catabolic. It's in the breaking down mode. It's breaking down your fat stores, your glycogen stores, as a last resort, your muscle fibers to actually propel yourself forward. They're doing 2 different things. In addition to that, doing this really big, destructive strength training and then going and running on tired, busted up legs is likely going to result in not just not gaining a lot of muscle, but also increasing the likelihood that you're going to get injured in that running because you're running with really poor form. This training tired thing, I 100% don't believe that it is a good idea. So I'm not calling anyone out for saying that hybrid training is not a thing. I'm just saying that you're really asking a lot of your body to, within the same day or even the same week or even the same month, do 2 things, being build up muscle and learn how to perform endurance training really well, is going in completely 2 separate directions, which I don't think is going to allow you to do either very well. Can you run and be a big person? Absolutely. I've trained John Clark, who is Britain's strongest man, to being able to run 48 marathons in 48 days in 48 UK counties. But it's not like he was an excellent runner and he lost a ton of muscle mass. So just understand that if you are going after this hybrid model, you have to be really conscious of running and potentially creating injuries, and very conscious and just accept that you're not going to be as jacked as you were before. The third risk is that power to weight events suffer. And this is where a lot of people say, well, I don't want to do strength training with my endurance training because I don't want to get big because I don't want to get slow. When I get big, I get slow and I need to be light. Well, couple of things. Even some of the most jacked, dedicated bodybuilders in the world only gain about 1 to 2 pounds of muscle per year, and that's when all they're doing is dedicated bodybuilding training. Us endurance athletes, it's almost going to be impossible for us to put on muscle while we're doing our endurance training, so don't really worry about that. The second thing is, let's say you're a freak of nature who can put on muscle really easily with strength training. Well, there aren't really too many events in endurance races that being super light actually helps. When we look at triathlon, it's actually been shown that body weight really has no outcome and no relation to your total race time. Body composition does, so being more muscular than you are fat, which strength training really helps for, is actually going to increase your likelihood of having a good race. It's my personal PBs in Ironman, half Ironman, and sprint races, all of which are thought to be focused on just being really super light, were actually when I was about 10 pounds heavier than I thought that I should be, because holding that extra weight kept me a little bit healthier and more durable. One of the only places that this is really legitimately a factor is if you're doing a ton of climbing. If you are a Tour de France rider and you're doing nothing but climbing in the mountains, then it might help, but I can also tell you that some of the fastest people in my province, when I would go toe-to-toe with them sprinting, on flats, on climbs, some of the biggest guys out there were some of the strongest cyclists because they were healthy, because they were durable. So I really just wouldn't worry about it. You're splitting hairs. At the level of being a Tour de France contender and a climber, that's where power to weight really matters. For us amateur triathletes, it's a bad excuse if you're saying that you don't want your power to weight ratio to suffer. The fourth risk and drawback of including strength training into your endurance training is actually getting injured while you are doing that training. This is very legitimate, and this is where I think there is a major risk to doing strength training if all you do is lump that strength training on top of your endurance training without making it endurance sport specific. Typical strength training is very risky. There's a lot of torn rotator cuffs, a lot of torn pecs, a lot of torn quads and glutes. Typical strength training is brutal. It's meant to break down your body and be extremely ballistic. So when I see people that are just doing normal strength training for their endurance training, I know that it's A, not going to benefit them nearly as much. B, they're not going to get much out of that traditional strength training because they're not going to be able to build themselves up as they would if they weren't an endurance athlete. And then C, there's a high likelihood that they could experience injury. Of course, there are obvious exceptions with people who never get injured, but typical strength training is very injurious. The entire reason that I took up triathlon in the very first place was because in my 20s, I thought I was trying to be a bodybuilder, and I got injured. I tore my shoulder so badly that I couldn't lift a weight at all. I couldn't lift a 20-pound weight. So I had to start walking on the treadmill at the gym, and then that got boring. So then I went on the bike the next day, and then that got boring. So then I kept intermixing, go on the treadmill one day, bike the next day, and then swim the next day. And it was just because I got injured lifting. Finally, the fifth risk or drawback of including strength training in your endurance training is that people think that it takes more time. As we talked about in the science section of this complete guide, it actually doesn't really help for you to just lump strength training on top of your endurance training. You're going to get the most benefit if you replace some of your endurance training with strength training. In addition to that, I am a big believer, as you'll see in a couple of sections, in doing kettlebell training. One of the big reasons for that is you can outfit your house with about $200 worth of kettlebell training and be set up with equipment for probably 2 years. You're going to be able to do your strength training at home so you don't have to drive to the gym, Log in, check in, wait for people on machines, wait for your turn, shower, get home. You can do it in and out in a 30-minute session that start to finish, from going into the gym to breaking everything down, is 35 minutes of your time. That's it. And if you're incorporating it into your triathlon or running or cycling or swim, run, or duathlon training plan properly, you're actually replacing some of your endurance training with the strength training so that you're not actually adding on any more time. The fourth thing that we want to talk about in this complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes is the common errors that people encounter when they start including strength training into their training plans. Where can things go wrong? This is where you get to that make or break moment where you decide if strength training is something that's going to be a performance enhancer or a performance detriment. Now, if you avoid a lot of these issues and you get them correct and implement strength training correctly, then you can experience all of those gains that we talked about. So let's get into all those common errors and what you should avoid as you start including strength training into your endurance training race plans. The first one is ignoring body parts. This is where people say, well, should I just work on core? Or I'm a runner, so I don't really want to run on tired legs, so I'm just going to do my core and my upper body and ignore the legs because the legs get enough strength just by doing the running. Well, that's not the case. True, real strength means that your body from head to toe is strong, is stable. And the only way that you can get your entire body strong and stable is by training your entire body. And in my opinion, training your entire body together so that all of your muscle groups, from your left ankle on the outside of your foot all the way up to the right shoulder, that entire chain is able to be strong and taut and connected. By just training certain body parts here and there, you're not teaching your body to function well together. I think that it's critical to do movements, do exercise, and do the type of training that teaches your body to be like wrought iron, all tied together and firm, so that when you plant into a pedal or a foot strike or put your hand in the water and set a catch, that you can be firm from the tip of your finger all the way to the tip of your toes. That's true strength. The second common error that people commit when they include strength training into their endurance training is they go at it with the aspect of building muscle. I'm sorry, it's just not gonna happen. Building muscle is entirely meant to be anabolic, building up your body. Performing endurance training is entirely catabolic, is breaking down. When you're asking your body to even do the same thing within the same month, you're not going to really accomplish either. Of course, there are obvious exceptions with the hybrid athlete program where there are lots of people that are really big that are also doing running. But if you look back at most of those people, they were people who were already big and then got smaller. So these people that are showing that you can run and be muscular at the same time, I totally agree. Having been muscular before, it's going to be almost impossible for you to look the way that they look and run if you don't already look that way. It just isn't going to happen. The third error that people make when they include strength training into their endurance training plan is scheduling. What a lot of people do when they incorporate strength training into their training plans is they say, all right, I've got my training plan. Well, I've got this nice rest day here. That's when I'm gonna do my S&C, my strength and conditioning. And I'm gonna put it on that rest day. That, I think, is really detrimental to performance. The reason being that strength training takes a lot out of us endurance athletes because it is the thing that we don't focus on the most. It takes a lot for our body to handle it and actually repair itself from that. So that rest day becomes not a rest day, and then you're never actually taking rest. What I like to do in our endurance training plans on mymotive.com is we include the strength training on an otherwise intense and key day. Because that day is already intense, yeah, you might go and you say, well, it's gonna be really hard to do this strength day on an intense day. is this really right? It's right because it's already an intense day. It allows the intense days to be intense with the rest days to be rest. The fourth common error, we've talked about this in other sections, is being afraid of bulk. It's related to number 2. It's being afraid that you're gonna get too big and it's going to be detrimental to your endurance performance. As I said before, it's just not gonna happen. Even the most competitive bodybuilders in the world with all of the juicing and steroids in the world maybe put on 2 to 3 pounds of muscle per year. Like the average person in the gym might have a hard time putting on that 2 to 3 pounds with nothing but dedicated strength training year round. If we're combining strength training with endurance training, it's gonna be even harder to build up any sort of muscle, so you really don't have to worry about bulk. In addition to that, if you have more muscle mass, your metabolic rate is going to be higher, so you're going to be less likely to hold fat, so you might gain muscle, lose fat, have an improved body composition, and boom, even though you've gained muscle, you are still faster. And then the fifth most common error that people make when they start including strength training into their endurance plans is just lumping it on top of training. As we talked about in the science section of our complete guide, the benefits come when you first replace some of your endurance training with strength training, not just lumping it on top. The reason for that is we don't want to overload our body with more than it can handle. And if we are currently training 10 hours a week and then we all of a sudden step up to 12 hours a week or 13, that's a 20 to 30% increase right away in strength training, which is very, very hard for your body to handle at the start because it is breaking down your body so much. So we want to include it, but make it supplementary to our training as opposed to adding it to your training. Adding in strength training to your training is not really going to get a whole lot of juice from that squeeze, but replacing some of your training with strength training is going to save you a lot of time, and that's where you're going to get the performance benefits. Our second sponsor for today is Athletic Greens, and this is AG1. AG1 is a product that I use literally every single day, and I started doing so because I wanted a replacement for a traditional multivitamin. Traditional multivitamins, if you've used them, you know that your pee turns lime green, and essentially you are flushing money down the drain. And you're making very expensive pee because your body isn't able to absorb traditional multivitamins in its typical form. AG1 has 75 vitamins, minerals, nutrients, all from whole food ingredients so that it's very easy for your body to absorb. It's in a greens powder, and I can tell you from experience, and I'll save you the nitty-gritty gory details of why I know this, but I know that my body is absorbing this. Basically, I know that I'm not making very expensive pee. So if you want to try this out, Athletic Greens has made it easy for you. You can get a free year's supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packages with your first purchase of AG1. You can do so by going to athleticgreens.com/Taren. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Taren to take ownership of your total health with this all-in-one nutritional insurance. I love it. I'm seriously a big fan. All right, motivator, let's get into this fifth concept of the complete strength training guide for endurance athletes. That being, what exercises should you really be focusing on? Remember when I said before that traditional strength training applied to endurance training plans really just doesn't work. You have to have endurance sport specific strength training. The exercises that you choose to do and the exercises that you choose not to do is going to make a big difference in whether or not you see a big performance increase from including strength training into your plan. Get it right, and you're going to see a bunch of improvement. Get the exercise wrong, you're going to spend a lot of time throwing around weight and not seeing a big improvement. So let's talk about the main exercises that you want to focus on to reduce injury, to improve economy, and increase the likelihood that you are going to age well and perform well in your races. So let's start diving into what the best exercises are for strength training for endurance athletes. And the way that I approach this is, what are the most common injuries and imbalances that endurance athletes have? And then let's start reverse engineering. How do we make those imbalances balanced? How do we make the tightnesses loose? and how do we make the body nice and stable without having weak areas? So studies have shown that the most common injuries for endurance athletes are in the feet, things like plantar fasciitis, in the lower legs, so things like Achilles issues or shin splints, runner's knee, pain in the outside of the knee often caused by tight IT bands and tight glutes. Then pain in the lower back is really common. And then for swimmers and triathletes, pain in the shoulders is also really common. There have been a couple different times that I've had injuries. The two most significant ones were in my right shoulder as I was preparing for a 27-kilometer marathon swim, and then Achilles on the left side as I was training for half Ironmans. The really interesting thing about these two injuries is that both times that I went to a physiotherapist to deal with it, the physiotherapist prescribed the same exercises to fix it, being strengthening the stabilizer muscles in the core. The reason for that is when your stabilizer muscles are off and you're performing 10,000 strokes in a swim workout or 15,000 steps in a long run or 100,000 rotations in the course of a week on a bike that are all in the same repetitive motion, if your body isn't really stable and very solid and there's no wobbling whatsoever, you are likely going to develop injuries because your body just can't sustain that amount of force when it's done over and over and over. It's called repetitive use injuries. It's the same reason that hands and wrists end up getting injured from people who are just sitting and typing. When you're doing something over and over repeatedly, it's hard for your body to actually stabilize itself. So that's why I think that the very best exercises for endurance athletes are stability focused, are stabilizing focused. Things like the glute med in the side of the bump, things like the side of your core, twisting movements. But really, it's making sure that the outside of your ankle all the way up to the outside of your shoulder can be one strong chain. It can all work together. And the only way that you do that is with compound movements. So compound movements are multi-joint movements. This is like the difference between a bicep curl, which is one joint, just your elbow, and a deadlift, which is a lot of joints. That's your ankle, your knee, your hips, your shoulders. Compound movements are forcing more muscle groups to activate, and it's forcing your body to work together as a whole, because I'm sorry, it really does work together as a whole. Everything is tied together. And by focusing on one aspect, like I see people that want to improve their hamstring strength so that they can run better, and then they go and do hamstring curls. But it's not teaching those hamstrings to work with any other muscle group, and then you go out and run when the hamstrings need to work with other muscle groups. So the idea of isolated movements that aren't compound, I really just don't get. Unless you have a very specific imbalance that has been completely diagnosed as that muscle group needs extra work, you really should be focusing on stability movements, compound movements. Personally, I really like dynamic stability movements. So for example, doing a kettlebell snatch. Kettlebell snatch is where the kettlebell starts in between your legs, it's swung out in front of you, up over your head, and then locked overhead. If you can even change that to starting across your body, swinging it across in front of your body, and then up and twisting with a lighter kettlebell, this is going to make your feet fire. They're going to grab the ground. Your ankles are all going to have to be mobile. Your hips are going to have to move. Your stabilizer muscles in the glute and the side of the core and the obliques are all going to be activated, and the shoulder is going to activate. It's still a snatch, but it is so much more dynamic and so much more applicable to real life, being running, cycling, swimming, taking your garbage out, taking your groceries out of the car, catching a kid that's running at you, lifting somebody up. Your body always has to work dynamically. It's not in a controlled scenario almost ever until you put it in a controlled scenario with traditional strength training. So we really like dynamic movements. The unfortunate part about that is that this section becomes really hard to actually explain, because if you're listening to this, you're not going to understand me talking about it. If I am showing you in the YouTube video, I can show you a couple of exercises, but really it's taking all exercises and putting a spin on it so that you're feeling unstable, so that you are able to put out a lot of weight while being a little bit challenged to have to create your stability and a strong, stable platform. That's one of the big reasons that I like kettlebells. If we look at a dumbbell and holding a dumbbell, the center of mass in that dumbbell is right smack in the center of your hand. So if you hold that up in front of your chin, there's no wobbling, there's no pulling one way or another. It's right in the middle of your hand and it's well balanced. A kettlebell, on the other hand, it has a center of mass that is away from where you're actually grabbing it. So just by holding a kettlebell up, it's pulling you off center, and instantly all of your stabilizer muscles have to activate to stabilize yourself. That's why I really like kettlebells, because just by the very design of the weight, you are having to stabilize yourself and activate all of your core dynamic movements. It's very, very practical. It's like how weights are designed like groceries. You're carrying it in a handle and the weight is somewhere else. You are catching somebody who's running at you, you are holding them in a certain area, and the weight is continuing in the direction they're running. This is practical movement, so this is why I really like kettlebells. I won't just leave you hanging and say, well, just buy kettlebells. Some of the recommendations that I will give you specifically for the areas that we're talking about, the feet and lower legs, do your exercises barefoot so that your toes and your feet have to activate. Use a wobble board and just Google wobble board, get it, and do some wobble board movements to make your foot and your ankle function really well. Do that a few times a week. Do lateral stability kind of movements where you're not just planted on the ground, but you're planted on the ground and you're having to either stop yourself from moving side to side, or you're moving side to side and your body is having to plant itself and stop it from being tipped over. I want you to work on quads, hamstrings, and glutes, but do it in ways that the body has to work together. So I like squats and different variations of squats. A really good example is a squat where you're holding a kettlebell in one hand, so it's pulling you off center, and that squat is going to activate your core, so that you have to stabilize yourself and stay nice and upright, but then doing the squat, it activates your quads, your glutes, and your hips. It's just an easy way to take a very simple movement and all of a sudden make it very endurance sport specific. And finally, the way to activate your core is typically not by doing specific core movements, it's by doing a lot of twisting and stability movements. Movements that send you off axis and force you to activate that core really stably and carry some weight and even twist while you're doing it. That's how you're going to create that connection to the core into all of your limbs. So I know that it's not a perfect answer of how do you do it, but anyone that's giving you a perfect, straightforward answer of do these movements is actually giving you an incomplete answer. We have done the 5 best movements for runners or cyclists, kettlebell workouts in this YouTube channel, but as I finish those workouts, I go, that's really just 5 workouts of 60 that I could possibly give, because it's not giving people the full picture. I'm giving people a fish instead of teaching them how to fish. I will put a plug-in for our app at mymotive.com. We actually have 25 hours of guided kettlebell workouts that you can follow along. And as you go through these, they're designed specifically for endurance athletes to alleviate the issues of feet injuries, lower leg injuries, runner's knee, lower back, shoulder injuries. And as you start doing them, you start understanding how we take movements and make them very endurance sport specific. But if you don't want to use our app for your endurance training, you just want the strength training, you can go to mymotive.com and you can buy just our 25 hours of guided kettlebell strength routines. And we do give guidance on how you can insert them in the training plan best for you. All right, motivators, let's talk about the next section, our complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes, that being the sets, the reps, and the weight that you should be focusing on. And this is where we start getting into the nitty-gritty details of how does endurance sport specific strength training look such that it is complementary to your endurance training plan and doesn't take away. Getting the sets, the reps, and the weight right is a big part of what you need to make sure you're getting right to avoid some of the risks and errors that we talked about before. So let's get into specifically what you should be doing and how to do it. We're just gonna sum this up with 3 different ranges of reps because it then relates to the weight. 1 to 6 reps in weight training is designed for purely strength. It tends to not actually build a whole lot of muscle. It doesn't really build muscular endurance either. It makes you strong without putting on a lot of bulk. This tends to be really heavy weights. I've historically really liked this rep range of 1 to 6 reps because it improves your strength while not putting on bulk. We've already talked about in other sections how we don't need to really worry about putting on bulk, but having that focus on strictly strength. And a lot of the studies have shown that the very best strength training that you can do to improve your economy as an endurance athlete is this super heavy, low rep range kind of training. The issue that I've come to have with it is that it tends to be really intense. Like we're talking 2 times your body weight kind of deadlifts, like really intense low reps. It's like you've got to earn the low reps by going super heavy. What I have historically found is this becomes very taxing on the body. You become really tired, really beat up. Neurologically, it takes a lot out of you because you have to psych yourself up so much. If you've ever seen a power lifter, an Olympic lifter, there's a reason that they're doing smelling salts and screaming and yelling. It's because it is so emotionally and physically and mentally draining that it takes a lot out of you. So I say that yes, there is a time for that, and if you want to go really heavy and do some of that low rep Olympic lifting, do it in the off season. Do it when there is not a race in mind and you can concentrate solely on that, and then for a very small amount of your exercise, you're doing the endurance training. You are going to give up a little bit of like perfect endurance strength training, but I think you're going to gain a lot for practicality by not doing that all the time. The second rep range is the 8 to 12 rep range. This is the bodybuilding rep range. This is the hypertrophy, the muscle growth rep range. This is what a lot of people typically do. They just figure, well, 8 to 12, that's what you do with your strength training. And I really don't believe in this for endurance athletes because the reason that people do 8 to 12 rep range kind of sets is it's designed to max out at that 8 to 12 reps, create that muscle damage, you do it a few sets, your muscles get damaged, and then you eat a whole bunch of protein, fills back up into those little muscle tears that you've created, and then you grow muscle. Couple of problems with this is 1, it's gonna be hard to be that anabolic, so the actual repair process is going to be hampered when you're doing endurance training. Second, those damaged muscles are going to be more likely to actually increase injury when you go and do your endurance training later in that week or the very next day. Third thing is that it creates high likelihood of those small little micro tears being very big tears and getting injured. And this is where you tend to feel fairly dumpy. So I'm not a big fan of that kind of rep range and that kind of weight. The final rep range is the 12 plus rep range. And you might say, well, Taren doesn't like the 1 to 6, he doesn't like the 8 to 12. He must like the 12 plus rep range. This is the muscular endurance rep range. This is where you learn how to do something over and over for a long period of time and withstand that amount of load on the muscles. This tends not to build a lot of strength, it tends not to build a lot of muscle, it tends to build the ability for your body to fire repeatedly. So theoretically, this is actually quite good for endurance athletes because that's what we have to do. We have to fire our muscles repeatedly. The issue with this is that it's not really improving any structure in the body whatsoever. So you might say, well, we shouldn't be doing heavy 1 to 6 reps. We shouldn't be doing heavy to failure 8 to 12 reps. We shouldn't be doing over 12 reps and big rep ranges. What should we actually be doing? In my opinion, it's lighten the weights on everything and do a combination of all of them depending on the time. So sometimes you might want to do rep ranges in 1 to 6, but not extremely neuromuscularly maxing out. You might want to do a Tabata set with 40 seconds on, 20 off, where typically you're going to do about 8 to 12 reps. But again, I do it with lighter weight. Or you might be doing something where you are actually conditioning yourself and doing 12 rep ranges, getting your heart rate high. Now, I know strength and conditioning specialists are going to say, Taren, then it's not doing anything very well. Au contraire, what this is going to allow people to do really well is it's going to allow them to activate muscle groups, teach muscle groups how to fire, really improve the functioning of muscle condition and the muscle quality while not breaking you down and being detrimental to your endurance training. So reps, sets, weight, I would say reps depends on the workout. Sometimes it might be 2 reps, sometimes it might be 20 or 25 reps. Sets, I would stick with about 3 to 5 as typically is done. Weight, I think this is more the thing that I would focus on. And when it comes to weight, I would say comfortably heavy. Comfortably heavy in the sense that at the end of no set, are you feeling taxed? Are you feeling spent? Are you feeling like you gave it your all? I want you feeling like you've activated muscle groups, like you've worked, like you've maybe got your heart rate up, but you're really just teaching your body how to function together, how to be stable together, how to move dynamically together, how to tie muscle groups together, and all of this super heavy weight of breaking your body down, becoming massively stronger. Yes, it does have benefit, but I think the juice isn't worth the squeeze, that the detrimental effects to endurance athletes of those types of max out kind of efforts is actually more than the benefit is going to result in. And this is where I think people make a lot of errors with incorporating strength training into their endurance training plan, feeling dumpy, feeling tired. I think it's because they think that they need to max out more often than they do, when really I think they just need to teach their body how to move together. All right, motivators, let's talk about the final piece of our complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes, that being, how do we actually implement strength training into an endurance training plan properly? That is a big part of pulling all of this together. You can understand what you might expect to achieve, what the science is, what the risks and the errors are, what exercises to do. But if you don't know how to properly include it into an endurance training plan, everything's going to go out the window. But with some very simple guidelines, you can make sure that strength training is very supplementary and complementary to the endurance training that you want, as opposed to detrimental to the endurance training, so that you can reach your endurance race goals. So let's get into specifically, how do you incorporate strength training into an endurance training plan properly? The last thing that ties all of this together is, how do we incorporate strength training into a plan? And there's 2 parts to this. It's where do we put it in a week and where do we put it in the year? That's something that almost no coach changes and something that almost no coach really even thinks about, but I think it's one of the most important things, is not just the weekly scheduling, but the annual scheduling. And I'm going to go into our Motive Training app to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So this is our Motive Training app, where you can get all of your endurance training plans for triathlon, cycling races, running races, swim runs, duathlons. It takes care of all of the endurance training and then coordinates the strength training on top of it. I'm gonna go into the training plan for the settings. This is the baseline training plan. This is like base building season, this is off season. This is when you're not in a specific race, how do we set up a week? So I'm gonna edit the baseline training plan and we'll take it to, let's say, about 8-9 hours a week. This is, I think, really good for a baseline amount of training. And let's just focus on the strength training. This is going to give you a good idea of where we put it throughout the week. So you can see that strength session number 1 is paired with an otherwise intense workout, the intense bike. Strength session number 2 is paired with an otherwise intense workout, the steady bike. Strength session number 3 is paired with another key bike. It doesn't have to be paired with a bike, but the big thing here is that we have strength on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. It's spread out a little bit throughout the week so that you're just dripping the doses throughout the week and you're letting your body recover a little bit, and you're pairing it with an otherwise intense day. That's what you want to do. So whether you're doing 2 strength sessions a week, 3 strength sessions a week, 1 strength session a week, you want to do those strength sessions with an otherwise intense day. This is getting into allowing your body to be rested on the rest days and work on the work days. If you put your strength session into a rest day, that rest day all of a sudden isn't rest anymore. It is all of a sudden another on day, leading you to a higher likelihood of getting injured. While we've got this base training plan up, we can also talk about how do we schedule things on an annual basis. So remember, this is a base training plan. This is while I'm not focusing on a race. And you might say, oh, okay, 3 strength sessions. That's what I should do every single week. Well, yes, I think that that is an excellent thing to do for your training when you're in a base training plan. It's going to be supplementary because when you're doing base training, your endurance training is all not very intense. So you can put more of those intense effort levels into strength training. So during baseline training, we say, yeah, up to 3 30-minute strength sessions per week, and those strength sessions can be pretty intense. What a lot of coaches don't do is they just say, well, 1 or 2 strength and conditioning sessions year round and just fit that into your schedule. But I think it's really big to load up on the strength building, the intensity, the actual improving your strength and working on it and being intense and intentional about it during the baseline training when you can, with 3 strength sessions all designed fairly intense. But how does it look when you get into a race period? So I'm going to add a race and we'll just call it a strengthy race. Doesn't matter how far out we put it, but we can choose any one of these events. We've got triathlon, cycling, running, swim, run, duathlon. They're all gonna look the same. Let's just go for a marathon training plan and set the training for finishing feeling strong. What's going to be different that you're going to notice about this is that the strength is just 1 time per week. When we get into a training plan specific preparation kind of phase, you go from 2 or 3 strength sessions a week down to 1 strength session a week. We also want to change the nature of that strength session to a very mobility and light kind of strength session, more about just hitting muscle fibers as opposed to building muscle fibers. What that's going to do is it's going to be complementary to your plan. So during the baseline training phase, when you don't have a lot of intensity, you can offset that intensity with the strength intensity. When you do have a plan that you're preparing for, you're going to have a lot of intensity in your endurance training, so you want to offset that with not a lot of intensity during your strength training. We also decrease the amount of strength training so it's less muscle damage on your body, so you can really focus on the task at hand, preparing for your endurance race. So this is what I think a lot of coaches miss. They just say, all right, let's do strength training. But I think that throughout the year, strength training needs to change. And what we've done in our app is we've created 25 hours of guided kettlebell strength and mobility sessions. And the strength sessions are designed to be intense during the baseline training. You got lots of them during the baseline training. They're less frequent during the race training, and they're less intense during the race training. The mobility yoga training that we've also created, which is about, I think, 20 hours of guided yoga training in the app, is very similar. A little more intense, a little more challenging during the baseline training, and then a little bit easier, just a little more rejuvenating, a little more relaxing during the race training. So they become complementary to each other as opposed to competing with each other. And I think that is a huge, huge key that a lot of coaches are really missing out on. And it's one of the things that we hear from people constantly throughout our app. We don't hear, wow, the strength workouts are really challenging, or, oh, I really got to buckle down. They say, the strength makes me feel good. As opposed to feeling beat up from it, they feel rejuvenated, they feel better, they feel like they're aging better, they feel like they're able to function better. We were on a call with some of our athletes this morning where one of our athletes was saying, I've just been doing it for a few weeks and my range of motion has opened up completely and I can handle all of these weights so much better. My body just feels stronger. That's what we want. We want you to feel good from your strength training in addition to performing well in your race. I told you at the end of this, we're going to talk about this pie chart. If you're listening, what we have is a pie chart with 3 slices. The first one being 50%, second one being 25%, and the last one being another 25%. These are the 3 things that I think are going to result in the biggest improvement if you get it correct when it comes to strength training in your endurance training plan. The 50%, what that is simply including strength training in your endurance training plan. A lot of people fuss about, well, should I use kettlebells? A lot of people are talking about barbells. And then a lot of people are talking about very alternative methods like Aaron Carson uses with lighter and more mobility focused kind of weights. The vast majority of the performance improvements that you're going to get are just based on including strength training as a whole. That's it. When you start fussing about exactly what training you should be doing, what methods you should be doing, you're really getting down to like fine tuning and what you enjoy. By just including strength training, half the benefit is already done for you. So when people start asking me, well, you like to use kettlebells, but somebody else likes to use barbells and more Olympic lifting, what do you think about that? It all just really comes down to having good, strong muscles. I believe in kettlebells and our methods. Other people have reasons for their methods. One of the big things to understand though is this second piece, this second 25%. And this is where it gets into making sure that whatever you're doing with the 50%, just including the strength training, is then worked into your training plan appropriately. And this is where I think a lot of coaches go wrong. A lot of coaches are maybe strictly strength coaches and they just lump on their strength training on top of the endurance training plan that you're doing elsewhere, but they're not coordinating. In my opinion, that coordination of including the strength training with the 50% and then getting a strength training plan that coordinates at the right time of the week, at the right time of the season, where the movements of the strength training that you're doing in your plan are complementary to your endurance training is the second piece. Just include any method of strength training. I think you've got 50% of the benefit, but get a strength training plan that really coordinates with your endurance training plan, and then you get even more benefits. That's what we've done with our Motive Training app. Every single one of our 50 guided kettlebell workouts that accumulate 25 hours is designed in conjunction with what you're doing that week. And I think that's where you get a huge amount of benefit. But that strictly endurance only focused strength training plan might not actually translate to being a better human. This final 25%, I think, is where you can coordinate endurance performance improvements and life performance improvements, health performance improvements. I think that it's important to do all of these so that you are, yes, reaching all of your endurance sports goals, getting to those races feeling confident, healthy, injury-free, feeling strong and not wobbling across the finish line, suffering, but also being able to translate that strength and that confidence that you've built by taking up endurance sports and doing it in a strength-focused kind of way into real life, because that's all what we really want. We want to be better humans. We want to live longer, healthier, and be more functional and have a more enjoyable life. So that is the final 25% there. So to wrap up, I want to close with these 5 points that you can walk away with and apply to your strength training for endurance racing plans. Whether you're using our app or not, this is something that you can take and apply to whatever situation you're doing. The first is I really believe in kettlebells. Try it out. Might cost you 50 or 60 bucks to get it, but a kettlebell is so excellent for stability, for dynamic movement, for variety, for explosive power, for not beating you up and being detrimental to all of your endurance training, and for not breaking the bank. It's really very practical. The second point is to do strength training 2 to 3 times per week when you're not specifically training for a race. So that means 3 to 6 months, depending on the length of the race out, you're ramping down your strength training and your intensity. The third point is that when you get into that race plan, you want to step it down but maintain 1 strength session per week, but have it focus more on mobility and just activating muscle groups as opposed to really building up strength and building intensity in your strength. The fourth thing that you need to walk away with is pair your strength training with otherwise key days. Let your rest days be rest and let your on days be on, really on. And typically strength training is not the bulk of what we're doing, so it tends to take a lot out of our body as endurance athletes. So you want to make sure that that is not paired with a day where you're supposed to be recovering. Pair your strength training with a day that is otherwise quite intense. Finally, when you start doing strength training for your endurance training, don't just lump it on top. As the studies show, you can replace some of your current endurance training with strength training and even perform better. Then if you want to ramp your endurance training back up, you can always ramp it up, but just by lumping it onto the top, you are likely going to create overload, potentially overuse injuries, and potentially overtraining. Why not get all of the benefit without all of that risk by just stepping it down, calming it down a little bit with the endurance training for a bit, and then ramping back up if you choose to later. So Motivator, thank you for watching or listening to the end of this complete guide to strength training for endurance athletes. I really hope that it is beneficial to you. If you found this helpful, all of these concepts are automatically laid out for you in our endurance training plans in our app that you can get to at mymotive.com. You can try our app for free for 14 days, and the beautiful thing about it is that it coordinates all of your endurance training plans. In that app, we have endurance training plans at every single level, at every single time commitment that you're able to do for triathlons, running races, cycling events, swim runs, and duathlons. Just add in the race dates and it prioritizes what you need to train for when. It also includes 25 hours of guided kettlebell strength workouts and about 20 hours of guided yoga mobility workouts that is all coordinated with your training plan in mind. So you're getting the right training plan at the right time with the right strength and the right mobility so that you become a very well-rounded athlete and a well-rounded human. You're gonna be able to kill it on race day without killing your body. Thank you for getting to the end of this. Later, motivators.